All right, our guests are starting to come in.
Should be a little closer.
All right, well, it's 7 o'clock. We're going to get started. We're so excited to have our conversation tonight. We're talking about investor advocates for social justice, and we're discussing ways on how faith-based organizations, large and small, can activate their assets in service of mission and values in order to advance social justice and economic mobility. We've got some great panelists tonight. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to talk to you about what is Oikos Institute for Social Impact. Oikos Institute for Social Impact works with HBCUs and historically Black churches to monetize their mission. For many of us who've gone to HBCUs or grown up in Black churches, these have been the anchor institutions by which our grandparents and parents have introduced us to. I'm a proud HBCU grad, Howard University, HU. And Howard definitely means a lot to me. I have the opportunity of serving in the AME Church, one of the oldest Black churches in our country. And so super excited tonight as we gather to have this conversation. And the Oikos Institute for Social Impact is working diligently across the country to help provide access and resources so that we can use the assets that we have owned for more than 100 years to address issues of social justice and economic mobility. Tonight, we specifically want to talk about what's happening in the investor space, both in the public markets and the private markets. We've got a great group of panelists who have devoted their careers to this space, who can give us some ideas about what's happening in local markets, what's happening and from a sort of meta perspective nationally in this country around foundations and place-based investors, and then how some of our religious institutions are thinking about investing in the Catholic Church, the Islamic faith, et cetera, how they're thinking about engaging with their endowments and their assets. And so let me, with that, introduce our panelists. Charnay will be with us tonight. She is most recently with Impact Philadelphia, doing some great work in place-based investing. And we had a chance to catch up at SOCAP. She did some wonderful work there and really helping us sort of frame how we think about place-based investing. And then Courtney is just a powerhouse. She's one of our great athletes from the state of New Jersey, doing some real incredible work around social justice and advocacy with the Catholic Church, helping them think about how to use their assets for social justice and mission. And then, of course, Monique Aiken. Everybody knows Monique. Let's give a round of praise for Monique. Just powerful in her own right, shaping content for organizations like SOCAP. And right here in our own backyard here in New Jersey, got a chance to meet Monique at the Newark Rutgers campus, where she was helping us sort of understand the continuum of social impact or impact investing. And so you hear a lot from her tonight. But I have not done a fair job of introducing our panelists, and I know when to get out of the way. My mom told me sometimes men just need to be quiet. So I'm going to be quiet, and Charnay will introduce herself and more fully, followed by Courtney and then Monique, and then we'll get into our conversation tonight. So Charnay?
Thank you so much, Reverend. I really appreciate the intro. A fantastic job as always. And welcome everyone. I'm really honored to be in community with you all tonight. My name is Charnay Robinson Williams. And, I've spent over a decade in the nonprofit management field supporting organizations. And most recently, I've transitioned to social impact and the impact investing space, specifically looking at place-based investing, which is simply deploying your capital locally and having more of that local lens when you think about impact investing. I've worked, as he mentioned, with Impact PHL as Director of Community and Content, SOCAP also supporting their content and framing out some of their work with the Summit, Impact America Fund. And I'm really excited to share that I'm also a collaborator with Make Justice Normal, MJN, which Monique Aiken will explain later. I also have my own consultancy agency, Noir Impact, here to support social impact organizations, faith-based organizations, and BIPOC founders navigate this thing called impact investing. whether they need information and education on, deploying capital or receiving capital. So that's a little bit about me.
Hi, I am Courtney Wicks, and I serve as the Executive Director for Investor Advocates for Social Justice. Our mission is to advocate on behalf of a community of investors whose faith-based values promote human rights, climate justice, racial equity, and the common good. And we do that through a number of capital stewardship activities such as shareholder advocacy, proxy voting, and mission-aligned investing. I also serve on the board for the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. It's a 300-member organization and representing collectively around $4 trillion of assets under management. And our primary mission of that organization is to promote good capital stewardship, along with corporate social responsibility practices and policies. And we do a lot of corporate engagement within that network. My organization, IASJ, is a member of the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. And then I also chair the movement building work stream for the Porticus Foundation Netherlands, which is basically bringing together faith-based organizations globally to try to help move approximately $10 to $12 trillion of assets under management towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And then lastly, IASJ, my organization, is the fiscal sponsor for the Racial Justice Investing Coalition, which is tasked with trying to advance racial justice within the capital markets.
Thank you, Courtney. Monique?
Hi, everybody. So delighted to be here with you all this evening. As Reverend Tiffany said, I wear many hats in the field of impact investing. I started my career in finance after getting an undergrad degree in international politics at Georgetown. So I was just up the street from Howard. Spent a lot of time running back and forth across town. But after nearly 12 years in investment banking, I thought that, it couldn't say on my epitaph that she helped energy companies manage the volatility in their income statement as a life purpose. And so I sought more meaning and more purpose from my day, and moved towards impact investing after a couple of years at the Clinton Global Initiative, which was basically my graduate school education in social impact. Marrying the two things, impact investing made a natural fit. It wasn't a term when I was graduating business school in 2005, and a few years thereafter, it became a thing. And I thought this was a great way to marry all of my skills and talents. And so I've been now in the impact sector for about nearly 10 years. I started my career, my first gig in the impact investing sector was Tideline, which is a boutique strategy consulting firm in impact investing. Spent a little time at Mission Investors Exchange thereafter, and I've now been at the Investment Integration Project for nearly 2 years, or a little over 2 years, I should say, which is marrying systems thinking with investing. As Sharnae said, I'm also a co-founder of Make Justice Normal, which is a collective thinking to open space for people thinking about justice and it pertains to capital. I'm also the co-founder of the Restarter Fund, which is hopefully coming soon to a world near you. It's in the concept phase at the moment, but we may aim to be a climate justice and economic justice focused loan fund and a B2B ecosystem that is just necessary in a post-COVID world, specifically targeting small businesses that went out of business, who are going to be left on the cutting room floor, as they say, in the post-COVID recovery. No capillaries really connect to them. And so we want to think about that particular gap and fill it. In addition to that, I'm a contributing editor at Impact Alpha, which is a digital news magazine for impact investing space. I'm on the steering committee for International Endowments Network, and I am often a judge at various things like mint competition and other things. I'm on the board of the Institute for Nonprofit Practice and on the advisory board for the Global Bio Fund. And I think that's enough, other than my 3-year-old will join us any minute now. So I'm also a mom.
Impressive, so impressive. Thank you guys so much. It's not lost to me, this is Black History Month, and I know we celebrate Black history every month of the year, but certainly I am honored to be with each of you tonight as you are making history and establishing new legacies. We talked a lot about place-based investing and investing in general. And we often think of this for-profit businesses, entrepreneurs. At Oikos Institute for Social Impact, we really want to look at who the asset owners are in our community. And in many cases, it's our African-American churches, our Black churches, it's HBCUs that actually own the property, still located in our communities, even though a lot of our members are commuting into these communities and no longer live there. There are a number of people that are still in those communities who may not be a part of that church, may not share that faith tradition, but still look to these institutions as a resource and as the catalyst for help. Courtney Charnay, you've been doing work around place-based investing, creative placemaking. I know I met you at Impact Philadelphia last year. Talk to us, what is place-based investing or creative placemaking? Tell us about that, and what's happening there, and what did you learn in your time in Philadelphia?
Yes, well, what I learned is that, there are smaller convenings happening all across the country. And I know that you're a big part of that and the work that you're doing with the Institute and your conference coming up. What we are seeing is that there are tons of faith-based institutions that are unfortunately underutilizing the tool of creative placemaking and impact investing. This is something that various organizations seek to educate and inform, but it's often surrounded by a lot of questions, concerns, and kind of folks are unsure, what is this thing? If I have an understanding of investment, am I getting a return on investment? How do I measure this? Who else is doing this? And so the work that I was doing regionally with Impact PHL was sharing case studies and providing folks with real life experiences so that they can see how impact investing and place-based investing aligns with the work of the church and or their faith institution. It's really a no-brainer when we think about our faith and our walk and what we seek to do in our everyday life. It would be no different when we look at the capital that we carry. So place-based investing is really a tool to solve problems that the church is already working towards solving. It's another tool in that toolbox to help you better serve your community. And when we think of faith-based institutions, I know I think of it as an anchor in that community. So what better way to reinvest into your community? What better way to anchor some of the smaller businesses or employ folks and provide opportunity? There are tons of investable opportunities right around us regionally. And so it is organizations such as Impact PHL that really take the time out to identify those opportunities for you, kind of already do the homework for you in a way so that your institution can then review, do due diligence, and hopefully deploy that capital. But one thing that we have found in this, and hopefully our panelists can support today and help, is that faith-based institutions have barriers to getting this work done. So once they say, yes, Rev, we want to participate in impact investing, we want to learn more, we see the value in, aligning our capital with our faith walk. But maybe they don't have shareholder buy-in. Maybe their trustees and their congregation is just, they're not sure. Maybe they don't have a financial advisor that is actually on board with impact investing. So we want to make sure we provide folks with resources to deploy capital regionally, but also, deploy capital with their faith in mind.
Thank you very much. Courtney or Monique, do you want to add anything to that? I know each of you have sort of had your own sort of foray into place-based investing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can maybe speak to, or maybe follow on what Charnay just said about some of the barriers and challenges, and maybe ways to kind of think about removing those barriers and challenges. And we spent pretty much the better of the last 2 years with our mission aligned investing program, just trying to break down and better understand what those barriers are, and then try to figure out creative ways for our cohort to remove those barriers. And I think, what Charnay said is right on the money about, sometimes it's the finance committees, sometimes it's the financial consultants that they're working with. And I think, ultimately, the one thing that I think really resonated with our cohort of faith-based investors was, you are the asset owner, you're the client. And that at the end of the day, what you want to achieve is what goes. And so just kind of realizing that first and foremost, so that when you are getting pushback from your finance committees, when you are getting pushback from your investment consultants, because oftentimes, they try to use very sophisticated, language that it can be intimidating. And so being able to kind of tap into some of the networks like the one Charnay is running, and some others, to kind of get up to speed on the lingo and the terminology as best as you can. But also, even if you don't, at the end of the day, you are the client. And if you want to have more alignment with your mission and values, and you want your money to be invested in that way, you have every right to communicate that to your investment professionals, and they do have the tools, if they want to kind of work with you. And if not, there are plenty of people out there like our good panelist and friend Monique, who I'm going to pass the mic over to.
Thanks for that. And I was just going to add a little more clarity when we start thinking about, when we say investing, what kinds of dollars and what kind of returns do we expect from them? And then also, what kind of impact can we expect from those kinds of dollars? And so depending on risk tolerances and the amount of capital, there's going to be different solutions available to deploying that in line with value. And so I think as we go down the road of thinking about what's the position that we are in, different kinds of investors, including those on this call, might have different kinds of dollars to invest, and different intentions from investing within 5 miles of where you sit to investing the world over. And there are different levels and depths of impact that can be achieved by different kinds of capital. So being mindful of that is also important. And there's some learning curve for that. If finance and asset classes sounds like, information that's a little obscure and hard to access, but there are folks who can help navigate and really understand, what kind of money do we have? What kind of return do we expect? What kind of liquidity requirements do we have of it? And then what would be the kinds of instruments that would help us achieve those goals? And so as we can break that down and set forth, the North Star, what those dollars should get to and help deliver on, I think place-based investors who are new at this, there's lots of examples to learn from, and we can learn by doing.
Thank you so much. I do want to clarify for those who are watching on YouTube or Facebook or Zoom, on this continuum, there are churches that are asset rich, both in cash and property. And then there are churches that are asset rich in terms of real estate, but no real endowment or cash investment. For those of us that are involved in active sort of organized ministry, oftentimes we are invited to request support from our brothers and sisters in Christ, from mainline denominations or Catholic or Protestant churches that do have endowments, who are investing those resources, but not really thinking about how to invest those resources locally into the communities of which they are part of. And then there are churches that have physical assets, but may not be able to make investment, but unaware of these place-based investing opportunities. And so I know in Morris County, where I serve, very wealthy county. A number of our congregations, Jewish congregations, Muslim congregations, mainline Protestant congregations do have endowments. And many of them will give out grants and small dollar commitments to programs and activities, but may or may not have thought about their endowments and how they can invest in things like affordable housing or some of the efforts that congregations that are low wealth congregations or under-resourced congregations have. Courtney, I know you work with much larger investment strategies around public equities, but I also know that some people you talk to also invest in private as well. Talk to us about sort of this public-private dimension around thinking about social justice from an investing lens and how we can sort of make more impact-related investments.
Yeah, so with many of our affiliates, they have their endowments that are invested in oftentimes in the public markets, but then some of them have taken steps to create what they call a mission-driven fund, which is really focused on investing for impact specifically, while they figure out how to increase allocations with their main fund over a period of time. And then I have some affiliates where their mission is what they call is going to be complete, where there's maybe like one particular order has 2 nuns left. And so they're doing a complete sort of spend down of their capital to be, reinvested into with a social mandate specifically. And so, it just really depends on the affiliate, but there are lots of creative ways and interesting ways that this can break down. I think, congregations kind of have to think about how do I build institutional wealth more broadly across multiple asset classes, because that is kind of what I see within the Catholic, specifically within the Catholic realm. You can, in New Jersey, you can go 20 minutes from where I live and you can run into Caldwell College. Well, that's run by the Dominican Sisters of Caldwell, and they not only have a university, which consists of real estate assets and what have you, they have an endowment. They also have mission-driven funds. They have a climate solutions fund. So it just depends. That's a much larger, one of the larger orders. But when I think about sort of their mapping of institutional wealth, I think it's pretty diverse in terms of how they've sort of broken things down. And now they're figuring out, well, how do we increase our allocations towards impact and impact investing? And how do we use special sort of social lenses and screens on our main portfolio so that our portfolio can be more in alignment with our mission and values. And so when I think about sort of the Black church and and the HBCUs, I think there's such a tremendous opportunity to start doing sort of that mapping exercise, starting with the assets that they have today, and then, mapping out over a, 5, 10, 20-year period where they want to go with that wealth. And it's very, very possible, because when you think about the history of the nuns, they didn't start to really build that type of institutional wealth after Vatican II, which was, I think after the 60s, and really they started to do that at that point in time. So it's very, very possible to kind of, and they started with pretty much nothing, relatively speaking, of course, but relative to the archdiocese and relative to the brother orders, they were pretty much retiring in squalor. And after Vatican II, that structure kind of got fixed, and then they figured out, like, how do we build institutional wealth across multiple asset classes? And so I think that is very possible, and I think it's very needed, and in our community specifically.
Thank you, Courtney. You know, one of the buzzwords that has been floating around lately is this word reparations. And for many people, reparations is focused more about what the government owes back to people who have been formerly enslaved. But at least in my church history classes, a number of churches benefited from slavery, benefited from the labor of immigrant labor pools. And so this wealth has been stored up and it's now being invested. And this is something that people don't really give a lot of thought to. But if I think I have this right, Monique, help me if or Courtney or Charnay if I got it wrong, but 5% of the corpus is given out in grants or has to be given out in grants for foundations. And 95%, is to be invested. But part of what I'm hearing is, particularly for faith-based endowments, how do we participate in this idea of reparations where the clerical side of this, the clergy side of this, are having conversations about racial reconciliation, about sort of coming together and making peace. But I don't hear this in the investor space when people are thinking about where they want to invest their dollars. How do we think about taking those dollars that were accumulated from segregation, Jim Crow, slavery, and now this wealth that has been accumulated? How can those dollars be used to invest in communities that are still kind of waiting for this opportunity to live in the abundance that this country offers? I know I've said a lot, but what are you seeing, Monique or Courtney or Charnay, in terms of these race conversations when it comes to thinking about ESG or DEI from an investment perspective?
Well, I can start, and then Charnay, of course, jump in. Courtney, feel free to fill in the gaps where I leave them. But I will just say this is a big question, and part of where we begin is, for me, racial injustice is a systemic risk. Everyone has been beneficiary to the fact that there was subjugation, exploitation, and oppression. The country was founded on quote unquote free labor from people who were captive and brought across from their homelands. And that free, zero cost to labor and free quote unquote land that was stolen from indigenous people is how the United States created all of the wealth that the United States created. It's the ultimate engine of zero cost to your land and zero cost to your labor, and then all profits get privatized to specific people who are only people allowed to have ownership. We have all have the fallout collectively. So as we think about what do we need to do now, because our institutions were built on this very premise that extraction, exploitation were where we began, everyone. So the responsibility to do something about that is also everyone's, but we can begin with policies, programs, and practices that we have today and make them more equitable. Getting to justice does involve thinking historically and saying, where have we specifically failed specific groups, and what is the targeted universal solution that we need now, to kind of reference John A. Powell. But specific groups have been harmed in specific places more. And what we need to do for those people in specific, I ran a podcast called The Reconstruction, which was about the chance to get it right, because we had a chance during the Reconstruction period of America to have a multiracial democracy, and all of that went along with it. Well, what are we going to do the chance of now is a different question. But also, what do we need to rethink about the way this was built? Because this system was choices that people made. So what do we need to do to rethink those choices and build something else? But also, where do we need to have redress? Because unless we actually take accountability for where we are and those who have received more from the fact that these structures benefited and privatized wealth in small groups of hands with very specific people, what do they have to do in order to redress? And the redress can come in many ways. So I don't think there's a one size fits all for what does reparation looks like. Perhaps from the government, it should look a certain way, but from private institutions and from people, it can look different. So I'll just offer that up, that I think the rethink is important, but the redress is necessary for real healing, because until there's accountability, is there a real apology? unless you're doing something else. If you say sorry and you do the same thing over and over again, are you sorry? So I think the question that folks should ask themselves as at a personal as well as institutional level, where did we benefit in a disproportionate way? And where did we cause harm with our anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, whatever else other anti to whatever groups that your policies, programs, and practices may have harmed that you need to atone for? I mean, the atonement word is not a word used often in investing, but for the faith-based community, that should be something familiar. And so therefore, if we hold ourselves to a different standard, perhaps a potentially higher standard, then what are the activities that we need to pursue in order to rethink the way we do business currently, redress where we have been party to harm, and where we have received excess value from the fact that these systems were exploited, and where should we invest now to fix what we broke?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Courtney? Oh, Chardonnay, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I mean, this topic really just gets me going. There's so much work to be done here, but, just to speak to your question earlier, Rev, where you asked, what can faith-based institutions do? Well, even though we're all Jersey girls here on this panel, I'm from the South Side, so closer to Philadelphia, and really going to kind of big up Philly right now because the faith-based community in the region, they're doing work on reparations. And so I think one of the ways that we can explore this topic more is just looking at what other organizations, faith-based organizations, are doing. And of course, this has more of a place-based local lens to it, but it can be applied wherever your faith institution is. So I know in Philly, last year, it's pandemic time, so don't quote me on that, but there was like a week-long seminar called Rise Up for Reparations. And so there are over 100 different faith-based organizations that came together. Particularly one that comes to mind would be the Unitarian Church. I know some folks out of that community in Philly and Germantown specifically that are doing fantastic work in regards to impact investing, but also reparations. But more specifically, just to give you a case study here to follow up on later, the Germantown Quakers, they actually gave somewhere near like $500,000 they committed to reparations. And what that looked like was deploying that capital specifically as reparations for Black folks in the region, in their community, in real estate, legal services. They outlined what their mission was there, but that was their way of participating in reparations and actually not being performative, but like doing something about it. And so as faith institutions, you can think creatively locally and also how you can support your congregation. I've talked with other faith-based organizations in the region that decided to handle reparations within their congregation. It was a white church, and they were like, hey, we're going to give the Black congregants some money here because we want to do something about it. And so, as an institution, you can come up with whatever that looks like that feels fair, just, and is in a way that is equitable when we talk about reparations, the best way you know how. But just want you to know that there are institutions in Philly that are doing this, and just reach out. I think one of the things that is great about our region is our faith-based communities, they're really trying to convene and get together and learn from one another. And this is an area that they're all learning from one another and doing something about it. And the one last thing that I'll leave you on this, there's a fantastic book called Decolonizing Wealth. And it's by Edgar Villanueva. Please forgive me for the pronunciation there, but I recommend anyone who is interested in reparations work, racial equity work, to check out the book. It's a very short read. It gives you 7 steps on how to decolonize wealth, and also just like how you are thinking about this. So as a church, maybe you have a finance committee, or, any working group that's specifically trying to start impact investing within their church and have a racial equity lens, I highly recommend this as a group read. So it can help frame out some of your, investments moving forward.
So, yeah, I think, so I guess to Monique's point and to Charnay's point, reparations can look like, can be a lot of different things, but I also want to be mindful that not to shortchange ourselves, because when we think about the amount of wealth, the cumulative amount of wealth that has been acquired over, hundreds of years, it's not insignificant. I also want to raise the point that reparations without systems change and power sharing isn't going to move the needle. So we have to also be mindful while we're calling for reparations, that we're also getting systems change as well, because apology without change in behavior is just manipulation. And I feel like if they are just basically able to say, okay, we're just going to hand you a check and that should be good, and then 50 years from now we're in the same situation, because I can speak to our work on the public equity side. When we're engaging companies, they're still doing the same stuff, and they're doing it right here on right here in the United States and across the globe. So I just I think part of the journey has to be aligning all three. Otherwise, we're going to continue to be sort of that kind of economic, social, and environmental violence is going to continue to be perpetuated on our communities for decades and centuries to come.
Man, Courtney, that was prophetic. We're going to have to do a clip of that and repost. Tomorrow night, Thursday evening, I'm doing an in-person panel with Black fund managers on Wall Street. And I was sharing with them, it's hard to believe I'll be 55 this year, but I was sharing with them, I got hired in 1990 at Goldman Sachs, and I was the first African-American recruited by Howard to go to Goldman Sachs. But the goal in 1990 was to be employed, right? Not systems change, to be employed, to get a paycheck. And that was a win, right? And so we were preparing for this conversation Thursday evening and saying, at this stage, it's not about being employed. It's about systems change. What does it mean for us to be a hedge fund manager? What does it mean for us to be investment advisors? How are we thinking about our roles from a systems perspective? And Monique, most of the work you're doing around systems change, that's hard work, right? Because we love celebrating the one person. I remember when I worked at Goldman Sachs, people say, oh, you're different, right? Oh, you went to Wharton, you're different. Like, okay, we're not talking about the one-off. We're talking about how do we change systems? Because there are a lot of people I grew up with in Philadelphia who are smarter than me. They just didn't get the opportunity because the system prevented them from achieving. And I consider myself blessed or lucky or, God's providence. But when you talk to us about systems change and the work you're doing around sort of just changing mindsets and systems of how we think about this whole landscape.
So if I had an air horn, I would have been sounding it off to every sentence that Courtney just said. And also to your point, if it's just the dollar transfer, it's not enough. That's still not enough to solve the problems of today, address the systemic risks of today. And sure, one person might have more, that one congregant who got more cash that day. That's good for them, but that didn't shift the thinking. That's what got us here, and nor did it change their future. And I think what we're talking about is how do we make the permanent structural changes and then backstop them when we have backlash against those things, because we know every step towards justice will be met with those who don't want it, who are perfectly happy with the system just set up the way it is because they're winning in this current paradigm. So there will be resistance. And there are a lot of people who don't want the systems change that we're talking about to share power, to shift decision-making, to have a normal population distribution that looks like the industry. The fact that 97% of white men in the global north still control almost all of the wealth in the entire world, that doesn't look like the global population, that distribution. And so something's wrong when there's an overrepresentation. There's just something off. Algae blooms when things are out of balance, right? So just use nature as an example. And so when at TIP, the Investment Integration Project, which is my day job, we're trying to connect systems thinking with investing through a term of art that the two co-founders coined many years ago called system level investing. It's literally an approach to do it all differently, thinking in systems. What are the systems that we have to center as investors? There are specific tools that are available to folks who have capital to deploy and have means of all sorts. If that can be other kinds of power that they have in the system, either individually or through coalition. And the system level investing will help us reveal the blind spots of how we invest right now. And conventional investing, the way things are, is usually short term, thinking about stakeholders and shareholders, not stakeholders, but also thinking about return as the one single metric. And if we're talking about change and power shifting, that's not included in how people evaluate themselves. So the system level investing is a way to think in systems as investors through the visualization of systemic risk, because investors do traffic in risk and understanding risk, mitigating them, and understanding what is a risk-adjusted return to this capital. So if we can talk about systemic risks like racial injustice, we can give folks a means to do something about it. And ultimately, for me personally, this is not yet where TIP is, but we need to center justice in those systems. Ultimately, we can get to more equitable distributions. We can think that we can deploy capital in ways that don't harm the earth, that don't cause more people to be under-resourced. But we also need to think about, the other ways that we create change. And some of those involve structural and policy reform and making sure that the regulatory environment also enables us to do things this way and differently, and also makes those changes permanent. So, we often try and have an analogy, since it's a bit meta for folks to think about system level investing, systems investing. I'm already got all this jargon. What do you really mean? And how do you actually engage with this thought? But one analogy that we often use, if conventional investing is a rotary phone, that's good and better than, messenger pigeon that you used before. But that's not actually, the ultimate evolution of where telephones have gotten to. And if sustainable and impact investing is StarTech Motorola, which was awesome at the time, it's still limited in its approach. The smartphone of today has all the legacy things that were part of a Radio Shack ad in the 90s. Since we're old enough, some people might remember Radio Shack. It had a camera on one page, a radio on this other thing. It had a camcorder. It had all these different component pieces, but system level investing puts it all together, turbocharges the processor, and does more things. And you can think about the apps, but that's what systems thinking makes you have to see. All of it zoomed out, including history, and thinking towards where it's going to go in the long run, and what is the ultimate outcome we're looking to achieve, and how do we get stability to the whole system. And that's what we want to achieve together, stabilizing what we refer to in finance as the beta, the ultimate context. We actually get our returns mostly from the context and not from individual alpha-seeking activities. But we spend 100% of our time generally on the alpha-seeking activities. And the beta is left to who? We have the tragedy of the commons, left to no one except potentially the government. And in certain places and jurisdictions of the world, those governments may or may not be able to do enough or have enough control or do it all by themselves. So to get to the systems change that we're talking about, we need everyone in alignment, including the forms of capital that come from governmental sources and philanthropic sources, to work together, zooming out in the way that, and incorporating all of these other different activities to get to systems change. It's a mindset shift. That's where you begin. You cannot have actions that are different until you change your mind about what you're willing to do and what you're willing to consider. And so we ask folks to start with, where do you begin at your governance or the documents that say how you can invest? Put the systemic intention there, specifically naming certain systemic risks. If that's available to you, you can just say systems and systemic risks are important. Or you can say racial injustice is important. Or you can say climate change is important. These are specific system risks. There are others. And after you start there, you can do other things differently. It all still sounds like investing, but like in physics, if you point your feet 1 degree in an angle differently from where you started walking, in a mile, you'll be in a far different place. And so the dream is that if we can incorporate systems thinking into the way that we invest, we'll ultimately have a more stable system that allows more people on the planet to not just exist, because that's where we need to start. Because right now we're close to tipping points on the environmental front, but also thinking about how do we allow more people to thrive? Black people, Indigenous people, the world over, other groups that have been marginalized in different contexts, might be by religion or their ethnicity. And how do we bring those folks in, support them, create a floor by thinking about designing for the most marginalized so that we lift the floor. The extreme poverty does no one a service, does not do the wealthy, nor because we actually net put a drag on all of our ability to actually create and thriving economies. The better position is that we want more people up from the bottom and a distribution that allows more wealth to be generated all throughout the system, but also it's the right thing to do. So as we think about connecting systems thinking and investing, ultimately the hope is that we can do this by changing practice now, but also thinking about, to your point earlier, Reverend Sydney, like history and where do we need to do specific things because of historically how this system was created. And also ultimately widen the solution space, because the challenges of today are different from the challenges of yesterday. And we're going to need new innovative tools and people involved in solving them. So as Dr. Jillian Marcel always says, we need to widen the solution space. And we get there by diversifying who's there coming up with those solutions, particularly investing, because it's obviously we've already talked about pretty monochromatic. And as we do that and allow more people to achieve their greatness, because to your point, Dr. Sydney, that you aren't the only smart guy who could have had that job, but you're the only one who got it. And so if we let those other smart guys and girls have access to these kinds of opportunities, what other additional brilliance would they possibly bring to the equation to solve the problems of today? Because we're going to need different solutions. We can't solve today's solutions with yesterday's tools. You need new tools. You need more people involved in thinking innovatively who are not stuck in the conventional past. The co-founder, Bill Burkhart, likes to say, we're using 1950s investing techniques. And if someone was using 1950s surgical techniques or told you they were going to, you would not let them operate on you. You would run. So why are we still using 1950s investing techniques when there's a new way forward and the world needs us to do things different?
Man, that was a lot, but powerful. I'm thinking as you're saying this, and I hope I don't offend any pastors. Normally, I would be at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor conference, and which is an amazing social justice conference. Some great preachers, love the conveners of that conference, but we're still using 1950 tools, right? And Dr. King, before his assassination, had already begun to make the pivot from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement, to looking at a global struggle for human rights and not localizing it to a particular state or particular region. And so as we start preparing for this conference we're doing in September, where we're convening faith leaders, what you said is so powerful, because those people on the forefront of social justice, I think of guys like William Barber, who is just a powerful voice, right? How are we engaging the powers that be around the system level change of empowerment? And sometimes, W. Du Bois talked about double consciousness. Sometimes the sacred rhetoric that we are sort of espousing is sometimes not confronting the systems of how we do business, right? We're still being complicit in the systems. And so we see in many of our urban communities, more churches being organized, but record levels of evictions, of crime, and our young people not being taken care of, domestic violence. And so while we're sort of espousing the sacred rhetoric, our churches are closing, our churches are dying, our pews are empty, and people are looking for real systems change And Monique, I think you're being prophetic tonight in this respect, that we're still trying to imitate what Dr. King did in the 50s, in the 60s. But this is 2023. And we need a different dialogue, a different conversation. So thank you for that, because one of the things we hope to do at Oikos Institute is shift the dialogue, right? It's not Republican or Democrat, and although I do think that's important, there's a systems level issue at work, and it doesn't matter who's in office, Democrat or Republican. If we don't do something about a systems level change, we will continue to see an increasing wealth gap. I saw some data recently that said that the wealth gap has widened more than it's been in 100 years because of just a lack of home ownership, a lack of entrepreneurship. And for many of these assets that we've owned through HBCUs and historically Black churches, we're losing those assets. It's time for a systems level change and a different kind of engagement. And so again, thank you for that. I know we have a few pastors on with us, both on YouTube and Zoom. What are some of the resources if people want to get smart to think about this stuff? What should they be reading? What should they be doing? How do they pivot?
Well, I'll just go. I mean, there's a ton of information out there. Number one, you're in the right place. So if you're tuning in today, that's a good start. And if you're a part of the Institute, even better. One of the resources that I can drop in the chat a little bit later is Iris Plus System. So this is a fantastic resource that's serving to help impact investing folks, no matter where you are in the spectrum, whether you're a beginner or, at expert level. So this is something that I will put in. It's a resource from Jen. And there's also a very good podcast called the Activist Podcast for Finance and Investments. And it's called Renegade Capital Podcast. So I'll drop that in there because if you're anyone like me, I love to listen to things on the go and really have that download daily. And then, as I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in racial equity work and really interested in informing your impact investing and place-based investing around racial equity, please check out Decolonizing Wealth. Again, I will drop those 3 resources in the chat.
Thank you, Charlene. Courtney?
Yeah, I think if you're looking for resources around capital stewardship, how to kind of be more active asset owners, certainly ICCR is a space to come to. But I think wholeheartedly, I like what Reverend Williams is doing, which is pulling this conference together where there's a convening of sort of, experts that are in the space and HBCUs and Black churches, because I do think that sometimes what gets lost in some of these other spaces is that they're predominantly white spaces that are kind of pushing out this research. And I do think that there does have to be sort of a convening that pulls sort of all of us together to start to unpack what kind of sort of economic future we want for our peoples and our communities more broadly, unfiltered. I think that is really, really needed. And I think we're going to end up talking about issues a little bit differently through our lens. Because just to give like a quick example, my family's from Louisiana, and both my grandparents, they lived on Southern University's campus because at the time, Southern University provided housing for Black professionals who were just coming up. And they lived on that campus for a better part of my mom, I think my mom was 17 when they finally built their house in a Black, they were part of founding a Black neighborhood, which was basically founded by a bunch of Black scholars who had lived on Southern's campus and then built this neighborhood. And I think, that came as a result of just thinking about how to best position our assets in our communities to best serve our communities, and without sort of the interference and impositions of, other groups that want to sort of impose what they think we should have and how we think we should be, unpacking and sort of pioneering systems level change. And so I think that space is really needed. And I think if we were to all come together in that space, I think it could be actually quite powerful.
Yeah, Courtney, again, I applaud you and Monique and Charnay as well, and just so many others I've met through SOCAT and traveling. This was not something that I was aware of when I worked on Wall Street. I only knew traditional finance, traditional markets. I appreciate what you said at the beginning, Monique, about working in investment banking and not wanting on your epitaph that you made a bunch of rich people rich, right? And had I known about impact investing, I don't know, maybe I would have been a pastor. Maybe I would have taken a different path. But I thought I had to leave completely to go do a completely different assignment. But just learning from you all and seeing what you're doing in the market, it's so powerful. And I think that more pastors and faith-inspired leaders need to know this space exists. To your point, Courtney, when I've gone to the MIE conferences or Impact Philadelphia conference or SOCAT, there's such limited representation of people of color in these spaces. So we are fully unaware. And many of our institutions are subject to predatory lenders, right? Subject to people whose assignment it is to take the assets that we've accumulated over decades. And so I think for me, why this conversation is so meaningful is many of us are just unaware of this space altogether. I know when we raised our first venture fund in 2004, and we talked about investing and having a double bottom line, doing good and doing well, people that we were crazy. It's like either you're gonna make money or you're not. Which one is it? And now we're talking about being conscious about our environment, about society, about governance. And so again, I applaud each of you in the work you're doing and hope that we can expose faith leaders or faith-inspired leaders to the work that you all are doing. Because again, to Monique, to your point, we've got 1950s tools, right? Like I'm all for protests. I got nothing against, Black Lives Matter protests. I'm down for it. I'm there. But we need some new tools, right? I'm all for, voter registration drives, right? I'm down for it. But we need some different tools. We need access to capital in ways that we have not had access. With the time we have left, I'd like to just go around some closing comments. Hopefully we'll get some questions in the chat. But let's see, we started with Charnay and ended with Monique. So Monique, why don't you give us some closing comments, and Charnay, you get the last word.
Thanks. And I will just say in your defense, impact investing as a term of art was not coined until 2007. So, it wasn't available to us in earlier parts of our career. And so as it is forming as a field, I think this is why now it's available to many more, because it's evolved so fast and so much over time. Because I think for Black people, people from the global South, and women, it's intuitive. Like, why wouldn't I not want these two things to be fused? Impact in the way I do business and the way I invest and all these other things. That just makes sense, because why would I want it any other way? Some people do want it some other way. So we're not here to talk to them. We're here to say there's tools out here available. And one of the ways that we can get smarter, I put in the chat that Dr. Sydney has shared it, Impact Alpha, which is, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a contributing editor, but it's basically across asset classes and other strategies for impact investing. It's a way to kind of like get familiar with what's happening and where in the world things are happening. And it highlights all kinds of different activities, place-based investing. At the global level, it highlights different kinds of asset classes, private markets, public markets activities. And so it's one way that's like a broad survey to kind of just catch up The preface to Bill and Steve's book that talks about system level investing is also what I shared. The podcast that I hosted is there because we talked about that earlier and talking about moving capital towards justice was that tagline. But I also shared Adesina's Social Capital, Pivotal Advisors, and Reparations Daily, because I think those are some of the other topics that we talked about. If you need advice and support in actually moving dollars, some of those places are where you can find it, but also just the conversation around reparations and what are people talking about, I think is useful for those who care to keep up with the contemporary conversation. The last thing I shared was Manning Maribel's book, How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, because sometimes we need to really understand how we got here to understand how we fix it. So my last word to everyone is that there is a world out here. We are resources that you can use. Come to me directly if you want some information. That I know we're, after nearly 10 years in the sector, where a lot of information and or people are. And I used to work on a trading floor with 6 screens and everything's moving and people are like, how can you even figure out what's going on? That's just how my brain works. And so I can sort all of this information that's poured into me and give you just the stuff that you need so you don't have to boil the ocean and just get on the Google machine and think, well, all these things say impact investing, because all of that is not necessarily useful for you depending on the stage that you are. So I'm happy to do some curation for folks. And hopefully we are all in this together and we'll help everyone, we'll help each other figure it out, not to learn.
Courtney?
I was just gonna wrap up by just saying, you talked about, we need some new tools, and I can speak from some of the work that we do at IASJ. We have a different kind of advocacy where we take social movement straight to the boardroom, and so through shareholder access, and so host 100 dialogues a year with different companies, file about 16 resolutions around a number of different topics: climate justice, racial equity audits, peace and demilitarization, you name it. And so there are these tools that are out there that are unique that can sort of bring our voices straight to the top. And, they're out there, and it's just a matter of mobilizing and gaining access.
Mm-hmm. Charnay?
Yes, and what I would like to add tonight is just to let everyone know, wherever you are in your impact investing journey, it's in your reach. And, be patient with yourself as you navigate the space, find pockets of resources. I think it's fantastic what the Institute is doing and Reverend Williams. So please take advantage of that. Connect with all of us on this call. We're happy to share our resources and plug you in. As a people, it's important that we stick together and that we lift each other up. And I think that impact investing wasn't necessarily a space for us initially, but we're here now and we're sharing our knowledge. And it's important that you take that charge as well. I personally see impact investing as a tool for liberation. And, this is our time to do right by ourselves, our congregation, our people, and generations to come. And we haven't touched on this at all during the call, but keep in mind, once you get this knowledge, like my grandmother says, no one can take it away from you. Once it gets up here, no one can take that away from you, but it's our job to then take it out and make impact in the community. But also, once we get it, let's share this out to the congregation. Let's share this out to our members as we also build wealth internally and externally. So I want to just leave you with connect, stay in community, have patience, and, use this as a tool for liberation.
Thank you, Charnay. You just reminded me, and I'm disappointed I forgot about this. Reverend Leon Sullivan was ahead of his time. Reverend Leon Sullivan was doing shareholder advocacy, the Sullivan Principles, fighting against apartheid in South Africa. And I think we've gotten away from that playbook of shareholder advocacy. So thank you, Courtney, for reminding us about the importance of shareholder advocacy and looking at who's running these companies and how they are making an impact in the world. And then the other piece, which I think is important, is this. I think you mentioned we didn't have access to this, and then Monique commented in the chat about, or just access to finance, right? We went through a period of redlining, sort of post Jim Crow, they were still redlining and preventing people from access to just the GI Bill even, right? Access to capital. And so now as you're heading this impact space, my wife and I talk about this all the time, we're trying to do community work, but we're given these small grants to do the impossible. And what we've talked about is, how do we access mission-related investments to go buy property, right? So we can be a nonprofit incubator, or we can create affordable housing. So you're right, Charlie. I think we need to get in this space. We need to understand it, how to access this capital. Right now, we're in an interest rate environment where banks are being more risk averse. And if they weren't making loans before, surely they're not making loans now. And so I'm excited about this space in particular because there is access for social entrepreneurs, for people that want to do innovative stuff. So thank you all so much. I know it's a Tuesday night. You could have been anywhere tonight, but you chose to share with us and spend time. I'm excited. Hopefully each of you will be with us in Chicago, September 20th to the 22nd for our inaugural annual conference of impact investing for faith-inspired leaders. We're expecting a great group to come together, and I'm looking forward to you all leading some conversations and just inspiring people in this space. I was hoping for some Q&A from the chat. Let me just check and see if anybody has any questions. I know we've covered a lot. I guess folks are mostly listening, but we know how to get to them. Certainly for those of you who are on Facebook or on Zoom, email me some questions that you may have, and I'll promise to get them to our panelists and to keep in touch. Right, we have stunned them in the silence, right? I love it. Well, I'm going to say good night, and thank you all to our panelists. Thank you for those who joined us this evening. And you can watch this on YouTube. It's there for those that couldn't get it tonight. It's there, and it will be reposted again for those that want to watch it later. So again, thank you all. Have a great night. God bless.